Hello listeners and welcome to Season 2 of The Cult Vault. As some of you may know, we have now officially launched. For anyone who would like to listen back to Season 1, you'll find my personal journey through cult education taking place from one episode to the next, going from knowing nothing at all to knowing at least a little bit about cults and coercion today in Season 2. Season 1 has some questionable audio quality and a lot of me rambling on, but some incredible guests whose stories are equally as important as anything that happens in Season 2. My aim for Season 2 is that you will find less of me rambling on and better audio quality. If you do find the content interesting or helpful, please consider rating or reviewing the show wherever you listen to your podcasts, or subscribe to the YouTube channel. I also have a Patreon page at patreon.com/thecultvault, where you can pledge to the show for exclusive and ad-free content. All of these links I've mentioned I will post in the episode description. If you're still here from Season 1, hello and thank you so much. And if you are just finding the show now, welcome. I hope you find this content educational. And now, onto the show. Hello listeners and welcome to this week's episode of The Cult Vault. I'm your speaker Casey, and today I have a wonderful interview for you all with Daniel Shaw. I hope that you all find this conversation as interesting and informative as I did and consider going to pick up some of Daniel's books. And now, here is Daniel Shaw. So hello Daniel and welcome to the show. Thank you so much for agreeing to come and take time out of your weekend to chat with me today. Anytime the subject of narcissism comes up, it's always your name that follows shortly after. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what I learn from your vast knowledge and our conversation today. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Yes, thank you so much for having me, Casey. I'm Dan Shaw. Daniel is my, nom de plume that I use. I'm a psychoanalyst and a psychotherapist in private practice. I work out of Manhattan, also in my home in the suburbs, and internationally now that we're all so much on Zoom since the pandemic. I am the author of 2 books on the subject of traumatic narcissism, and I also teach and supervise many psychotherapy students and practitioners. And I live, as I said, in the suburbs outside of Manhattan. And that's me.
It sounds like you're a pretty busy guy then.
I manage to keep fairly busy. I'm grateful for that. I enjoy what I do.
There's a lot that I am hoping to break down for the listeners today. So I was wondering if you wouldn't mind me asking you some questions at more of a basic level around this subject, starting with asking you what the definition of a psychoanalyst is.
Sure. Well, a psychoanalyst is a kind of talk therapist who has a specified training once you've received a clinical psychology degree. So in the States here, you can be a social worker, a psychologist, or a psychiatrist, and you would still need to enroll in a psychoanalytic training institute and undergo a course of treatment in psychoanalytic theory, which of course begins with Sigmund Freud back in the turn of the century, and which has been evolving ever since and modernizing and reforming over many iterations. So I am a psychoanalyst because I endured that very rigorous postgraduate training. And I'm also trained in a lot of other kinds of psychotherapies, especially in the trauma therapies. And I integrate my training in those kinds of modalities like sensory motor psychotherapy, EMDR, internal family systems. So I call myself a trauma-informed psychoanalytic psychotherapist.
Oh my goodness. That's probably one of the most impressive sentences I've heard this year. Wow. And how did you find yourself in this field? Is it something you naturally gravitated towards, or something that you kind of fell into as you were reaching further education?
Well, as a young person, I actually was interested in psychology, but my passion was always for the theater. So I was a theater major in college and trained and studied and worked a little bit as a professional actor all through my 20s. But at that point, I hit a wall. I wasn't really successful in the ways that I had hoped to be. And it's at that time that I was introduced to Siddha Yoga, the group that I eventually became a full-time worker in, and which I came eventually to recognize as a cult. So I spent most of my 30s, more than just my 30s, really, in as a manager and follower of Guru Mai, who was the head of Siddha Yoga and still is. And when I left, I had already decided I was going to go back to grad school to become a psychotherapist. But just as I began grad school, I also recognized that I had been in a cult. So my graduate program was training me to be a psychotherapist, but I also used that time to study the nature of cults. And while I was in grad school, my mentors and teachers and supervisors were psychoanalytic clinicians, and I liked them very much. I was drawn to it, and I determined that once I got my degree, I would finish up with, I would go on to psychoanalytic training. So I just left the cult and I just started my graduate degree, and I spent the next 6 years learning how to be a psychotherapist. And I also, during that time, did a lot of reading and thinking about the cult that I had just left. So that's how I found myself in the field of psychoanalysis.
Have you ever considered penning a memoir about those experiences, or is that something that you're not too interested in?
I haven't been tempted to write a memoir because what happened was that I began writing for a professional mental health community about cults. And in writing to the mental health community, I began getting published in various journals. I wanted to integrate what I had understood about cults into the way I was working as a clinician with all kinds of people, not just ex-cult members, but people who had been traumatized in other kinds of scenarios in families or at work or in marriages or in other kinds of communities. So because I was writing and I was writing about cults because I was determined to figure out what the hell had just happened to me for the last decade. And how did I get into it and what was going on? I was especially interested in the psychology of the cult leader, which is not something that I felt had been written that much about, other than just to call a cult leader a sociopath or and I wanted to break that down. So in writing about that, I found myself saying enough about myself and about why I had gotten interested that I didn't feel the need to write that memoir. And I still enjoy writing for the mental health community in my hopes of helping to educate more clinicians about the nature of this kind of abuse.
I think maybe the journey of penning a memoir is part of some people's deconstruction and healing. But I suppose what you've said to us there is that you were able to do that through also furthering research in the field, which is just a great kind of combination of the two. And the two books that you have written, Traumatic Narcissism, Relational Systems of Subjugation, and Traumatic Narcissism and Recovery, Leaving the Prison of Shame and Fear, both focus on the subject of traumatic narcissism. And the term
Right.
narcissism is something that I have recognized is thrown around quite a lot in almost casual conversations today. So I hoped to go all the way back to the beginning and really break things down by asking you to talk us through what you understand to be the defining parts of narcissism.
Yeah, well, you're right. It is thrown around quite loosely these days. Um, and that's fine. I think uh, it's been helpful in looking at some of our political figures to be talking about narcissism. But yeah, narcissism begins pretty much with Freud. It was one of his early concepts. He picked it up from some others that had been talking about it, but he really developed the idea initially. Now, later, the idea of pathological narcissism was developed by other psychologists who wanted to try to define it as a personality disorder. And in the way that it became defined and is used in psychology quite a bit, it describes a person who has a very grandiose idea about themselves, but who is also extremely insecure. So the combination of extreme insecurity and fragility with the combination of very self aggrandizing grandiosity is what we typically think of as a person who is a pathological narcissist. So when I began to, well, you're going to ask me, aren't you, what defines traumatic narcissism, right? So I just want to say that in terms of the way we think of narcissism in the general population, you know, people who are full of themselves, who refer everything back to themselves, who don't have much space for other people, they're not that interested, it's all about them. Those are all reasonable ways of thinking about narcissism. But I think what I wanted to do was go beyond the idea of pathological narcissism, which suggested that, you know, those people are both incredibly insecure and incredibly unrealistic and grandiose about themselves. I wanted to look at a specific subset of people who truly believed in their own superiority and entitlement to a degree that was so extreme that it led them to become people who would develop a group of followers who would be in complete submission to them. That came out of my attempt to understand the cult dynamic, the cultic dynamic. And I felt like I was talking about a kind of a narcissistic person who wasn't just your annoying uncle at the holiday dinner, but, you know, who basically was, you know, a kind of a pain in the neck, but who was, you know, probably not an evil, toxic person. I really wanted to talk about a more malignant kind of narcissism. And so that's what led me to start to try to theorize traumatic narcissism.
So please continue with what you found on what where your studies took you, because traumatic narcissism is not something that I'd heard of in regards to the term narcissism until people started recommending your research and your writing. So I wondered if you were the person to coin this term. And
well, yes, I think I am, and I also think I you know, at the risk of sounding you know, smug, I think I might be within the ex-cult community the first person to really identify a cult leader as a malignant or traumatizing narcissist. Now, previously, everybody was talking about sociopaths or psychopaths, and they were describing the person and what they did to other people. But I really wanted to break down the psychology of the cult leader because, you know, a lot of times when I became an ex-cult member and began to go to conferences The International Cultic Studies Association continues to this day to offer these conferences, and that's what I went to when I first left City Yoga. A lot of what was being talked about were, the evil nature of the cult leader. Well, I felt like the cult leader was a complicated person in my own personal experience. And by that time, I was a clinician, and a lot of people were telling me about their cult leader or ex-cult leader. And even more interesting, a lot of people were telling me about an abuser in their life who I thought was behaving exactly as I had understood cult leaders to behave. So I began to think of this as a way of understanding, why does somebody seem to believe in their own superiority? Why does somebody come to actually think of themselves as omnipotent, as possessed of divine entitlement? And how do they get to that point? And what are they doing with those beliefs about themselves? And I guess I'll break it down this way. So I called it traumatic narcissism because this kind of narcissist specifically traumatizes significant others and followers. And the trauma that they inflict involves creating a tremendous insecure sense of inferiority and dependence in the follower. So this could be a parent, it could be a boss, it could be any kind of authority figure. It could even be a sibling in a family that would hold this kind of power over another sibling. I was seeing it in families, I was seeing it in so many contexts. In the cult context, the narcissistic cult leader is a person that I see as profoundly delusional, and they have an extremely rigid delusion of their own omnipotence. Why? In my view, it's because they are defending against any kind of self-awareness around their own shame, their own neediness. Anybody who has been in a cult will probably agree with me that the cult leader is the neediest person in the world. Nobody is more needy than a cult leader. They need everybody to adore them all the time. They need constant reinforcement about how much power they have, how much control they have, and they need everybody to do whatever it is they want when they want it. And if they can't get what they want, they terrorize everybody around them until they do get what they want. To me, that speaks to an incredible, profound neediness that the traumatizing narcissist is hell-bent on denying. They want to be perceived as a person with no shame, no need of any kind, a person who's completely above and superior to any kind of normal human neediness or dependency. And so they present themselves as utterly shameless and utterly not in need of anything because they're already so superior that they have everything they need. Meanwhile, they develop relationships to people they can control. And those people become receptacles for that narcissist's disavowed shame and dependency. So if you're the follower of a cult leader, you live in a constant sense that you are not good enough, that you have to work harder, be more devoted, give more. And in this way, cult leaders persuade followers to allow themselves to be completely subjugated, to be violated in any way the cult leader sees fit, to be exploited in any way the cult leader sees fit. And so that way the cult leader actually completely masks his own neediness and dependency and shame by making sure everybody around him has those emotional experiences, and then he can convince himself that he does not. So it's a very it's a very manipulative and exploitive way of being in relationships with people, and it's meant to constantly feed the narcissist so that he can sustain his delusion of being completely omnipotent, right? So that's when I'm talking about the traumatizing narcissist's relational system of subjugation. That's what I'm talking about. They are engineering relationships almost like they're a farm. They're a farmer who is making sure that he always has enough crops to be able to sell. A traumatizing narcissist is always making sure he has enough people that he's controlling who can constantly provide him with the with the adulation and the adoration and the obedience that he needs to feel that he is in fact omnipotent, right? So I the thing about this dynamic is that it is not just with cult leaders. It's with political figures, it's with all kinds of authority figures. It certainly happens in families, and it happens in any kind of situation where there's a authority figure, a doctor, any kind of professional. It's a dynamic that you see in cases like Bernie Madoff, the American investor who swindled incredibly wealthy people, convinced them that his investments were, not only incredibly productive, but also that he was a charitable person. It's a dynamic that has to do with a delusion of omnipotence and the need to control and exploit others to sustain that delusion.
Oh my goodness. There's so many things that you've said that has my mind kind of like drawing parallels and linking things together. And it really helps to understand some things that I've been trying to perhaps define or identify in my own path of thinking around the various types of individuals that we might discuss on the show in terms of cults and coercion in regards to serial killers. I sat down with a retired superintendent named Colin Sutton a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about a serial killer by the name of Levi Belfield, who would subject loads of women around him into these horrible systems of coercion. Even though he was a horrible, grotesque man, he was able to really have that influence over so many women. And the whole thing you said around neediness has me thinking that makes so much sense with him as a case study, and thinking about con artists and thinking about the various different groups that we've talked about on the show that people might not necessarily jump straight to the word cult, family cults, one-on-one cults. We've talked about the armed forces and the US Marines and all different types of high demand groups that people might get quite defensive about when your podcast is called The Cult Vault and you're talking about coercive environments. So that's really interesting that you've just said all of those things.
The reason that became important to me had to do with my personal need to liberate myself from feeling completely controlled by the guru that I had worshipped. I recognized that I had lent myself to a delusional belief that person wanted me to believe, and that person believed themselves. They their idea of themselves as a god is a complete psychotic delusion, and yet it's held uh, so strongly, and it has so much power. Now, a lot of people would meet a guru like mine and say, "Oh, that person's just full of baloney." I don't buy that for a second. But some of us are vulnerable in one way or another at a certain point in our life, so that when we encounter that kind of person, we really buy into how powerful they are, how great they are, and how much they have to offer. We believe in what they're selling. We want to buy it, right? And I really wanted to break down that kind of person and recognize how absolutely weak that person really and truly is. Because having a psychotic delusion that you're God is not a sign of your strength. It's a sign that you're very, very sick. And yet, when we buy into their delusion, we get sucked. Like delusionality is a little bit contagious. And if somebody really has this delusion about themselves, it can draw a lot of people in, a lot of followers, a lot of people. And I spent 13 years believing that this person was some kind of, divinely authorized human being. And this person, when I left and opened my eyes, what I saw was somebody who was undereducated, quite illiterate in many ways, and completely dependent on other people joining their delusion. Strip all of that away. Well, there are many cases of cult leaders who've been exposed. One of them was the Japanese guru who released nerve gas in the subways. When he was exposed, jailed, and publicly humiliated in the courtroom, he literally became schizophrenic. And, similarly, the Nixium case in this country, which became filmed as the HBO documentary, The Vow, for the first time, really, in the history of cults that I know about, people exposed how fraudulent he was, what a liar he was, and how completely delusional he was. And he was sent to jail. But for so many people who suffer in these relationships where they're completely subjugated, exploited, abused, it's very hard to shake the belief in that person as truly omnipotent. And why I wanted to break down the psychology of the leader was to really try to help people understand that they're probably a better, smarter, and stronger person than the person they had worshipped as a guru.
That's pretty powerful stuff. If you go from considering the person that you have followed for a significant portion of your life is the most powerful, enlightened, or insightful person you've ever met, to actually having the tools to understand that they are none of those things, and how much of a, I don't know if this is the appropriate way to word it, but how much of a last laugh is that for you as somebody who moves away from that person and says, you have no power over me, because actually you're not powerful at all. That's like the worst fear of the cult leader. So it's like, it's kind of like a big middle finger to them, I suppose.
Yeah, it's a big middle finger, or last laugh is good, because, while I was working in the cult organization, that's where I learned to use computers and to type. I taught myself typing while I was there. And so it is a bit of a laugh to think that when I got out, I ended up writing 2 books using computer and typing skills that I had learned in the cult. I have to say that is a source of satisfaction.
In terms of looking at individuals who you might identify as traumatic narcissists, have you chosen any particular case studies to look at what the causes could be that might manifest into somebody becoming a cult leader or a traumatic narcissist, or both?
Right. I've only been able to make use of publicly available information about some of these people, and what I do think. So I'm somewhat speculative in this, but what I do believe marks a person for this kind of a role, even if they're only a parent in a family that is, you know, extremely controlled and subjugated, or in other words, if even if they're not some very successful cult leader, but just a petty tyrant in their own backyard. What I think marks that person is that they grow up in ways in which they feel deeply humiliated. And often they have abusive, shaming parents, or they've been neglected and sent off to boarding schools and been abused and humiliated there. These are people who decide at some point that that they're going to become so powerful that nobody ever can humiliate them ever again, right? And so I think that, putting it somewhat simplistically, but I do think that that's the essence of what leads a person to try to take on that delusion of omnipotence, because it's how they overcome a sense of profound humiliation. And you can look at the biographies of dictators like Hitler. You can look at Donald Trump. You can look at all kinds of other people. Shoko Asahara, the Japanese guru, is a good example. These are people who grew up feeling very humiliated and belittled, and who overcame it by developing this delusion of omnipotence. In some cases, then becoming world leaders who act out their rage and their anger by slaughtering millions of people. Stalin, Pol Pot, Mao. I mean, the unbelievable rage that these people have for almost like preserving their delusion of omnipotence means that they have to have the power to just end the existence of millions of people. That's the worst case scenario. Those are the most malignant narcissists. By the way, I would point your listeners to the work of Erich Fromm, who influenced my understanding of traumatic narcissism, because he wrote about these dictators. And Erich Fromm wrote about that in a book called The Heart of Man, and also in his book, Escape from Freedom. He was directly observing the 20th century dictators when he wrote those works. And he was analyzing their personalities in ways that very much influence how I understand them as well.
Which is interesting. When you say the word dictator, I think, sort of pre-20th century, but we have dictators today. It just feels like quite an archaic word, but we've seen, well, Augustus Pinochet, for example. I mean, there's been all sorts of people in that we could read about in textbooks that were around 70s, 80s, 90s, today, very much today.
Yeah, we have Orban in Hungary. We have China is not really a democracy. There's a whole group of leaders there. Of course, we have North Korea. So yeah, we're not free We have yet to become free. And in my opinion, Donald Trump has been hopeful about being able to be a dictator, very much modeling himself on the fascists, and having quite a bit of success. We'll see where it all ends up. So that's why a lot of people have been in touch with me because everybody's thinking about narcissism in America, but because of mainly because of Donald Trump right now. And
well, that's an interesting sort of topic of discussion, because a lot of the people who are finding themselves wrapped up in the QAnon movement, or one small section of it, whether that's kind of the anti-vaccine part of it, or the conspiracy theories around the royal family being a lizard population, or whichever, or JFK is actually, he's going to be walking through, parts of Texas with his son because they never really died, and Princess Diana's had a kid with Trump even after she died. So whichever part of the QAnon movement you're looking at, it seems to be that after what you've said, I was kind of perceiving it to be disenchantment with the state of the government, with the vote not going in the way a lot of people hoped it would go, with rising inflation, with the pandemic that we've all just lived through. It kind of feels like the world is at that point in history where it could almost repeat itself, like we saw with the human potential movement in the 60s and 70s. But with the technological age added in, you get a lot of people saying, we deserve better, I deserve better, I'm going to live in a world where there's no pedophiles or sex offenders because Donald Trump is our Lord and Savior and he is going to stop that. And a lot of these, not privileged messages, but messages from people that are almost echoing what you've said a traumatic narcissist might hold in their own values, even if it's external and not kind of for the whole world to see, like behind the mask, I suppose, if that makes sense.
Well, I think that everything you mentioned as a factor in the burgeoning, efflorescence of these conspiracy theories, which is terrifying, really, because these are just straight up delusions that people who were leading what would be seen as very conventional lives are willing to destroy their family and leave everything behind to go and die for. So there is something going on that's very, very much of this moment, and all the factors you mentioned are involved. But ultimately, I believe what drives people into the arms of gangs and dictators and terrorists and a domestic abuser or a cult leader is ultimately a desire to feel safe. And our world in many ways has felt quite unsafe. We have an environmental crisis. We have now Putin threatening a nuclear war. We have the pandemic. And many, many people, I believe, have been drawn into these conspiracy theories out of a desire they might not have even thought they had, a desire to feel safe. And these are a lot of people, I've gotten calls from people who are quite affluent, well off, and professional and well educated, and they're going insane because their wife or mother or child or adult child has gotten involved in these conspiracy theories. This is about people being reached at a very deep level, and we're all human creatures who were born completely defenseless, completely dependent, and everything in us is designed to try to feel safe. And so we attach to our parents and to caregivers and to, and our attachments in life, throughout our lives. Um, Basically, we're people who seek to feel safe and secure. So many factors have broken people's sense of trust. Certainly, propaganda in the media, especially through Rupert Murdoch's media organizations. This tremendous. If you listen to Fox News, I don't think you're allowed to have it in England. I wish it were the same in the U.S. But it's 24/7 terrifying people about how unsafe they are, because in this case they're being led by Democrats who are making them completely unsafe. It's this very profound, elemental, universal desire for safety that I think has that certain kinds of people, especially traumatizing narcissists, learn how to exploit to their own advantage.
Well, that's a much more concise and intelligent way of summing up what I was trying to say. So I appreciate you kind of going down that road with me throughout that thought process. And we've mentioned now some of the things that might contribute to somebody becoming a traumatic narcissist in life. We've spoken about Shoko Asahara. He was basically blind. Grew up in a very, very poor household with a huge number of siblings, and then was kind of shipped off to school for the blind. Could look at Charles Manson, whose mother, didn't really want much to do with him. I think she had him when she was like 15 with a man that was married. And then she shipped him off to various boys' schools, and then he was just in the prison system until he got released. And you could, do this with every single notable cult leader.
Yep. I think what
history.
you would see, I think what you'd see is that they grew up with intense shame and humiliation that they overcame by developing that delusion of omnipotence.
Do you think that it is the traumatic narcissism of your work or the subjugation part of your work that makes this really relatable for people in the recovery space in terms of cults and coercion, or is it a combination of the two?
Right. No, I think they need to go together. I think people need to, when I work with people, I work with a lot of people who have left cults. And some of those people were in that cult for a few years, some for 40 years, so I've worked with all kinds of people in recovery from being abused in a cult. And I think it's too, it's a sort of a multi-pronged approach, because people feel very ashamed that they allow themselves to be exploited and abused. People feel very frightened that they, that they'll make another mistake, or that they don't have the strength to resist being taken advantage of. People come out with all kinds of insecurities. And so it's so important to help people see that they were deliberately made to feel intimidated. That, the traumatizing narcissist does three things behaviorally to the people they want to control. They belittle, they intimidate, and they humiliate. So everybody who's been in a cult will probably be able to think, oh, was I belittled? Yeah. Was I intimidated? Yeah. Was I humiliated? Yeah. Like in front of everybody a lot. That was one of my experiences. But everybody I've ever talked to who left a cult can identify how much they were belittled, intimidated, and humiliated. So there's a lot of healing and recovery to find, your own validity, your own self-respect, your dignity. And part of that process, so there's that, going through that with people and really trying to help them regain their faith in themselves. But then there's also the being able to understand who that cult leader really is and being able to take that person off of their pedestal and smash the false idol, the plaster saint, and really recognize that they are not less than the person that subjugated them. And in fact, the act of leaving a cult very often takes so much strength and so much courage that even when people are terribly broken after they've left, I have to tell them, look at how strong and courageous you were to get out. So looking at how they were subjugated and looking at the personality of the traumatizing narcissist are two parts of the process of recovery in the way that I think.
And if you were able to look at traumatic narcissists and create almost like a framework of identifying traits, it's important to note that that's not the case for people that find themselves in positions of subjugation. And we try quite often on this show to really get into the heart of people's stories, not just talking about the parts that people might find most shocking, but talking about the whole story on how you were funneled into the group or how you were born into the group, so you had a predetermined personality and life ahead of you, and really trying to open up the floor to changing this perception that exists in the wider public that only certain people join cults, which of course I'm saying in air quotes. So
yeah.
Do you go into that at all in your writing? If you've looked at the traits of a traumatic narcissist, and then kind of saying that's not something that exists for the people that are subjugated?
Well, what I often say is that the reason why some people get into a cult is usually because they are vulnerable in certain ways at that point in their life, and they have the bad luck of being exposed to some kind of community or seminar or book or lecture, which is intriguing because, cults offer a lot of things. They offer promises of self-improvement, they offer community, and they offer purpose and meaning in many cases. So when a person is in a vulnerable place in their life, maybe they might be struggling with success, or they might be quite successful and feel somewhat empty. There's no, anybody could be deceived and manipulated into becoming part of a cult. Anybody could. For those who don't, they're lucky. In my opinion, they're lucky. If they got exposed, like when I was in my 20s, everybody, this was in the 70s, I'm ancient, but back then everybody I knew was doing EST, which later became Landmark Forum. And everybody was trying to recruit me into something. And whether it was a multi-level marketing thing they were into, or it was a large group awareness training like EST, everybody was trying to recruit me all through my 20s. And I knew that all of that was bogus and nonsense and ridiculous. By the end of my 20s, my vulnerability was at its peak in terms of frustration with where I was at in my life. And that's when I was introduced to City Yoga. And that's when I was at my most vulnerable and where I had an experience of being profoundly uplifted. So naturally, I wanted to pursue that and, get into it more. And the way I am, I throw myself into things very passionately. I threw myself all the way into it. And it was 13 years before I left and realized that how abusive and corrupt that it really was. So anybody at a certain point in their life, every human being at one time or another is vulnerable in one way or another. And it's at those moments of vulnerability that you might get turned on to an amazing psychotherapist or an amazing spiritual group, you might get turned on to a person, you might get turned on to something really healthy and constructive and wonderful, or you might get turned on to something that just looks like that, and which in fact is a cult.
I didn't realize that LGATs were so big in the 70s. I know that there was a lot of influence with Eastern mysticism and swamis and gurus. So I was kind of in my mind able to place your experience in history around the human potential movement and a lot of, as we know, religious groups that cropped up around that time as well. But I didn't realize that the MLMs and LGATs was so big in the 70s as well. It must have been an absolute minefield.
Huge. That's where, and it really all kind of begins in the States with Scientology. It's like the mother cult, and then everything comes out of it. And all of the guru cults that grew up, all of them have since been recognized as cults pretty much, but all of those incorporated both Scientology and, Werner Erhard was incorporating Scientology into Est and Landmark. So all of the cults in the 70s were all kind of mishmashing Eastern spirituality with Scientology or Est, or multi-level marketing with Scientology or Est. I mean, it really, you can really trace that history. And of course, there had been a previous history in the early 20th century with the Theosophy movement and Rudolf Steiner and Gurdjieff and so on. But Scientology kind of grabbed all of that and packaged it in a new way. And that was in the 50s, 60s. And then by the 70s, it was like the basic template for every cult.
That I find that fascinating, that part of understanding the development of cults and how coercive groups exist today based on all of those things that have happened and those blueprints and templates that exist because of groups that have, either birthed new practices or have taken influence and really morphed something into something else. I find all of that so fascinating, and that in combination with the stories of survivors who come to speak on the show to offer their lived experiences within those environments just really changes what I think myself and all of the listeners have come to understand on the subject of cults and coercion. So now I just have like a whole other feather to add to that hat in terms of researching where all of those things fit into the 60s and 70s as well. So that's that's I wouldn't say it's an exciting thing, but it's an insightful thing.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot now about your work and your research, but I wondered if there was anything we've missed in terms of the main themes and conclusions from your first book.
Well, I think in our, in the course of this conversation, I've covered much of it. The question that I'm left with, which I don't yet feel anybody's come up with the best answer for, is how do we inoculate societies from coercive control and undue influence and the worst cultic dynamics of systems of subjugation? How do we inoculate the public? So when I agreed to speak on a podcast like this, it's precisely because we're all kind of asking that question, and we're trying to talk about it and educate the public, and also join as a community of ex-members or former cultists. Most of us who speak out are really just hoping that in some way or other we find a way to inoculate more people from these kinds of abuses. And I've written the books I wrote mainly targeted to mental health professionals, but also, they are widely read by, lots of people who are not mental health professionals. But I've wanted to try to engage the mental health community in better understanding of these dynamics. And little by little, I I have been able to do that. When I wrote the first book, I was invited by probably 15 different psychoanalytic groups all around the States and internationally to speak on that subject, because I think a lot of people who are clinicians see it with patients who are in traumatizing families. It's important to understand that this is a broader problem than just what happens in families, although of course that's very significant. It's a problem that happens in our societies, in our culture, in our schools, in our education system. There are so many ways in which we are not protected enough. When I grew up, I'm a baby boomer, so my father had been in the Navy in World War II and so on. And when you've grown up in that generation, you know what happened in Europe in World War II. You know about the Nazis and about fascism and about Mussolini and about Japan. You know about the horror of that kind of cult mentality that could grip a whole nation. But I feel like today Americans have been sorely undereducated about this, and now we're seeing it trying to take root here. So how do we educate and inoculate not just individuals but whole communities and societies and nations? That remains, I think, one of the big problems yet to be solved for the human race. Even the climate change deniers are like a cult in so many ways, clinging to a delusion, and really the fate of the human race and the planet is what's at stake, right? So, we're just little people on a trying to. I think I saw that you have 500,000 followers recently. Is that correct?
Oh no, I mean, I had 500,000. I hit 500,000 downloads on my podcast, yeah, but not quite a following of that size.
But that's fantastic. You're doing something to help and educate and enlighten people about this. And whatever any of us can do, if we've been through it ourselves, whatever we can do to try to make this more accessible to people and more understandable, I'm down for that effort.
And if there is no answer to how we inoculate the globe against this type of narcissism or this type of abuse or trauma, is this the basis of a third book, perhaps?
Not that I know of. When you said that just now, it occurred to me that it's really very simple. We have this battle between selfishness and community and relatedness, and it's fear and selfishness that drives so many of the politicians who want to deny climate change and who I mean, that just we're accidentally human beings on a planet, and to think that we would allow greed and selfishness to be so powerful that we could destroy the whole thing, it's a big deal. So to me, it's all linked to the study of cults, understanding what happens in cults, and to whatever efforts any of us can make to try to preserve and help grow what's good about human beings and the planet.
Yeah, and community and trust and inherent kind of looking at someone and thinking you're a good person, and all of those things that come with what a lot of people are searching for when they find themselves introduced to one of these groups, I suppose.
Yes.
So you mentioned that you get a lot of people contact you regarding help or assisting or guiding people through understanding what's happening with their family members and loved ones around the QAnon movement. So do you work in the capacity of cult recovery, because you're doing 100 other things in terms of helping people with their further education, marking papers and exams and consulting on all sorts of things in terms of the world of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. So I wonder if you work in the capacity of cult recovery.
Well, I really, the thing I do most is see psychotherapy clients in my private practice. That takes up the majority of my time. And the other things I do are like extra. But there's two possibilities for people who are reaching out about a loved one who's gotten into a cult. And what I used to do more is help people understand how to maintain and try to preserve and grow a good relationship with the person who's gotten into that cult, so that they wouldn't burn their bridges, so that that person might know eventually if they needed to leave, they would have some place to go. I used to do that kind of counseling a lot more, but because things have gotten so dire since the pandemic, I tend to actually quickly refer people to interventionists. I don't think of myself as an interventionist, somebody who could extract you out of a cult. I do see myself as somebody who can help with recovering from cultic abuse. My therapy practice is part cult, ex-cult members in recovery, and part just people in the general public who have a problem they want to work on in therapy, a bad relationship, abuse in their family, and so on. So the need for help from interventionists to extract people out of cults is never been greater. And every interventionist I know is full to the brim, working overtime, trying to help these families. So I leave that work to them. They're better at that than I am. And most of what I'm doing is clinical work.
Okay. And in regards to the work that you do in the space of further education, is it your research now that's being used for those that are up and coming in the world of psychotherapy? Will they actually sit down and use your work as kind of the basis for their own research? Because that must be wild to you as somebody who went through that. I think you called it a vigorous post-grad training.
Right. No, it's very gratifying when I do see my work used in the work that people are doing. It's not like it's not taking the world by storm, but it's out there, and it's always very gratifying. And we all of the people in my field are writing each in their own area about what they think of as important to address. And not everybody's interested in what I think is important to address, but then when I do see it being used and picked up and appreciated, it's very, very gratifying, means a lot to me.
And your work was recognized by the International Cultic Studies Association recently when you were awarded the very prestigious Margaret Thaler Singer Award.
That was wonderful, really wonderful. And at the time, it's actually taken me a couple of years since I got that award to realize, I have made a contribution. I feel good about that.
That's amazing.
I just feel like I'm just trying to, make a living and pay my bills and do the best I can. But that was a lovely, lovely recognition, very much.
So if anybody was to look you up, where would they find you? Your website and your social media?
My website's the best place. It's just Daniel Shaw, LCSW.com. LCSW stands for Licensed Clinical Social Worker. That's my license. And that's the best place to reach me.
And of course, there are the 2 books that you have published on traumatic narcissism. So I will leave links in the episode description to all of those things and add them books to the list of other books that we've talked about on this show and authors that we've interviewed. And I just really wanted to ask you before we sign off today, if there was anything you wanted to leave the listeners with.
What comes to mind is that what I had referred to earlier, that all of us are hoping as human beings to find a way to feel safe and to live with dignity. And certainly when you've been in a cult, you've learned what it's like to feel frightened and ashamed. So, in some ways, that experience, the experience of having been abused in that way, I hope for your listeners, for the people that I work with, I hope what it leads them to understand is that as human beings, we are entitled to that dignity and self-respect. That's something that I think all the work in the area of cults is ultimately about, is helping people recognize that nobody deserves to be violated or exploited. We all are entitled to a sense of self-respect and dignity.
That's amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you for your time, for your contribution and continuous contribution to the world of cult education and recovery, for taking time out of your Sunday to chat with me today. And
It's been great.
And for being just such an open and compassionate person in regards to this subject material, which we know is tricky and unfortunately impacts people all around us every day in all manner of environments. So thank you so much, Dan, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, and thank you for all the work you do. It's been great to meet you. Bye now.
Take care. Bye. That is the end of this week's episode. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram @cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast.